The morning sun had barely risen over the quiet suburbs of Cleveland when Robert Chen's life changed forever. At 6:30 a.m., the sound of aggressive knocking jolted him awake. Before he could fully process what was happening, his front door burst open, and a team of police officers stormed into his modest two-bedroom apartment. "Get on the ground. Hands where we can see them," the officers shouted, their weapons drawn. Robert, still in his pajamas, immediately complied, his mind racing to understand what was happening. As an accountant who had never even gotten a parking ticket, this felt like a nightmare. The officers handcuffed him roughly, reading him his rights while explaining he was under arrest for a series of high-profile bank robberies that had terrorized the city over the past 3 months. Robert's protests of innocence fell on deaf ears as they led him out to the waiting police car. His neighbors peeked through their curtains, watching in shock as the quiet man they'd known for years was taken away like a dangerous criminal. Robert could feel their stares burning into him, the shame and confusion overwhelming his senses. At the police station, Robert sat in the cold interrogation room, still wearing his blue-striped pajamas. Detective Thompson, a veteran officer with 20 years on the force, laid out the evidence against him. Security footage showed a man of similar build and features robbing 3 different banks. The suspect had the same distinctive walk that Robert had developed after a childhood injury. "The similarity is uncanny," Detective Thompson said, sliding the photos across the table. "Same height, same build, even the same slight limp. Want to explain that?" Robert's heart sank as he looked at the images. The resemblance was indeed striking, but he knew with absolute certainty that it wasn't him. He had been at work during each robbery, sitting at his desk, processing numbers for his accounting firm. "I can prove I was at work," Robert insisted, his voice trembling. "Check with my employer, check the security cameras, check my computer logs. I'm an accountant at Sterling and Associates. I haven't missed a day of work in 3 years." Detective Thompson's expression remained skeptical, but he made notes of Robert's claims. As the hours passed, Robert sat alone in the holding cell, his mind wandering to his elderly mother who depended on him, his projects at work that needed attention, and his reputation that was being shattered with each passing minute. What made the situation even more bizarre was that Robert had always prided himself on being a law-abiding citizen. He volunteered at the local food bank every weekend, helped his elderly neighbors with their taxes, and had never even participated in a protest. The irony of his situation would have been amusing if it wasn't so terrifying. As night fell, Robert could hear the bustling of the police station starting to quiet down. The fear of spending the night in jail began to creep in. He thought about his mother, who would be worried sick when he didn't show up for their daily evening phone call. He thought about his boss, who would be wondering why his most punctual employee hadn't shown up or called. But what Robert didn't know was that his ordeal was about to take an unexpected turn. While he sat in his cell, another detective was making a discovery that would shake the entire department to its core. A piece of evidence had been overlooked, something so crucial that it would not only prove Robert's innocence but reveal a truth that nobody had seen coming. The sound of hurried footsteps echoing down the corridor caught Robert's attention. Detective Thompson appeared at his cell, looking flustered and somewhat embarrassed. Behind him stood a tall figure in an expensive suit, carrying a briefcase that looked oddly familiar to Robert. Little did the police know that their wrongful arrest was about to uncover one of the most sophisticated criminal operations the city had ever seen, and Robert Chen, the quiet accountant in blue-striped pajamas, would play a crucial role in bringing down an entire criminal empire. But for now, he sat in his cell, unaware that his nightmare was about to become one of the most extraordinary stories of mistaken identity and unexpected heroism that Cleveland had ever witnessed. The man in the expensive suit stepped forward, and Robert's eyes widened in recognition. It was James Wong, the regional director of the FBI's Financial Crimes Division. Robert had met him 6 months ago during a routine audit at his firm, though the encounter had been brief and seemingly insignificant at the time. "Mr. Chen," Wong spoke with a measured tone, I apologize for the circumstances of our reunion. It seems your wrongful arrest has inadvertently helped us connect some very important dots. Detective Thompson unlocked the cell door, his earlier skepticism replaced with what appeared to be embarrassment. You're free to go, Mr. Chen. We've verified your alibis for all 3 robberies. But Agent Wong here would like to speak with you. Robert was led to a more comfortable conference room, where a cup of hot tea awaited him. His handcuffs were removed, and for the first time in 15 hours, he felt his shoulders relax slightly. The room was warm, a stark contrast to the cold cell he'd been sitting in. That briefcase, Robert said, pointing to the leather case Agent Wong had placed on the table. I've seen it before. Wong nodded, a slight smile playing at the corners of his mouth. Indeed you have. In fact, you're one of the few people who've ever noticed it. That's partly why I'm here. He opened the briefcase, revealing stacks of financial documents. 6 months ago, when we met at Sterling and Associates, you were conducting an audit of some overseas transactions. Do you remember anything unusual about those records? Robert's mind raced back to that day. He had noticed some discrepancies in the international wire transfers, but they were so subtle that he'd almost missed them. There was a pattern in the decimal points, he said slowly, the memory becoming clearer. Every 3rd transaction had an extra digit hidden in the fractional sense. Agent Wong's eyes lit up. Exactly. You're the only person who caught that in 5 years. What you discovered, without realizing it, was a sophisticated money laundering operation. The man who's been robbing these banks? He's part of a much larger network, and he was chosen specifically because he looks like you. Robert felt the room spin slightly. But why me? Because, Wong continued, spreading out more documents, they knew you might eventually notice the pattern in their financial records. They needed a scapegoat, someone to take the fall if their operation was ever discovered. The bank robberies were just a way to get you out of the picture. Detective Thompson, who had been quietly listening, leaned forward. So they wanted Mr. Chen arrested for the robberies to discredit him? Precisely, Wong confirmed. If Robert was branded as a bank robber, who would believe his claims about financial irregularities? It was an elegant solution to their problem. But they didn't count on 2 things, the FBI already being aware of their operation, and Robert's perfect alibis. Robert's mind was reeling from the revelations. His ordinary life as an accountant had somehow placed him at the center of an international criminal investigation. The careful attention to detail that had made him excellent at his job had also made him a target. We need your help, Mr. Chen, Agent Wong said, his voice serious. Your understanding of these financial patterns could be crucial in bringing down this organization. But I want to be clear, this would be dangerous. These people have already shown they're willing to go to extreme lengths to silence you. Robert thought about his quiet life, his mother, his routine. Everything he'd built could be at risk. But then he remembered the humiliation of being arrested in his pajamas, the looks from his neighbors, the cold cell. Something stirred inside him, a mixture of anger and determination. What exactly would I need to do? He asked, his voice steadier than he expected. Agent Wong pulled out another document. We want you to go back to work as if nothing happened. Continue your regular audits, but this time, you'll be working with us. We'll set up secure communications, and you'll help us track these transactions in real time. Won't they know I've been released? That their plan failed? That's the beauty of it, Wong smiled. We've kept your release quiet. As far as the public knows, you're still our primary suspect in the bank robberies. The real robber will think their plan worked, and the organization will believe you've been neutralized as a threat. Robert took a deep breath, looking at the document spread across the table. His life had changed completely in less than 24 hours. The quiet accountant who had never taken a risk in his life was about to become an undercover FBI informant. One more thing, Agent Wong added, pulling out a final folder. "We believe someone inside your firm is working with this organization. We don't know who, but they had to have access to your schedule to plan the robberies around your working hours. Trust no one." As Robert left the police station in the early hours of the morning, still wearing his blue striped pajamas but now with an FBI wire hidden beneath them, he realized his ordinary life was gone forever. The sun was rising again, just as it had when this nightmare began, but this time, Robert Chen was a changed man. What he didn't know was that someone was watching him leave the police station, taking photos from a dark sedan parked across the street. The game was about to become much more dangerous, and the quiet accountant was now walking into a web of deception that went deeper than anyone suspected. The next morning, Robert stood in front of his bathroom mirror, adjusting his tie with trembling hands. The man staring back at him looked the same as always: pressed shirt, neatly combed hair, sensible glasses, but he felt like an imposter in his own skin. The wire beneath his shirt reminded him that nothing was the same anymore. His phone buzzed. A text from an unknown number: "Remember, act normal. We're watching." The FBI had his back, but that thought provided little comfort as he prepared to walk into what he now knew was a den of vipers. The elevator ride up to Sterling and Associates' 14th floor office felt like an eternity. Robert's heart pounded as he watched the numbers climb. When the doors opened, he was greeted by Lisa from HR, who seemed genuinely surprised to see him. "Robert. We were so worried when you didn't come in yesterday. Everything okay?" He forced a smile, remembering Agent Wong's coaching. "Just a terrible stomach bug. You know how it is." The lie felt bitter in his mouth, but Lisa nodded sympathetically and moved on. Robert wondered if she could be the insider. After all, HR had access to everyone's schedules. At his desk, everything was exactly as he'd left it 2 days ago. His "world's most average accountant" mug, a gag gift from last year's office Christmas party, sat next to his keyboard. His family photo, him and his mother at her 70th birthday celebration, smiled back at him. The normalcy of it all felt surreal. Opening his computer, Robert began his usual morning routine of checking financial reports. But now, every number held potential meaning, every transaction could be a clue. He'd been instructed to look for the same pattern he'd noticed before: the hidden digits in the fractional sense of international wire transfers. Around noon, something caught his eye. A series of transfers to a company in Singapore followed the exact pattern he'd identified 6 months ago. His hands hovered over the keyboard, unsure how to proceed. The FBI had given him a secure email address to report findings, disguised as a spam folder, but using it felt dangerous. "Hey, Bob. How's the Anderson account looking?" Robert nearly jumped out of his skin. It was David Park, his supervisor, standing behind him. David had always been friendly, but now Robert couldn't help but notice how the man's eyes seemed to linger on his computer screen. "Just finishing it up," Robert replied, quickly minimizing the Singapore transactions. "Should have it on your desk by end of day." David's hand landed on Robert's shoulder, squeezing slightly too hard. "Good man. By the way, sorry to hear about your stomach trouble yesterday. Glad you're feeling better." There was something in his tone that made Robert's skin crawl. As David walked away, Robert noticed something he'd never paid attention to before: his supervisor's Italian leather shoes, easily worth a month's salary. Had David always worn such expensive shoes, or was this new? During his lunch break, Robert didn't go to his usual deli. Instead, following FBI instructions, he took a walk through the nearby park. A jogger bumped into him, smoothly passing him a tiny USB drive while mumbling an apology. Robert slipped it into his pocket, his heart racing. Back at his desk, he discovered the drive contained software that would help him track and record the suspicious transactions more effectively. As he worked through the afternoon, patterns began emerging. The Singapore company was just the tip of the iceberg. There were similar transactions going to companies in Dubai, Jakarta, and Panama. At 4:30 p.m., Robert received an email that made his blood run cold. It was from the company's CEO, requesting his presence in the executive conference room at 5 p.m. to discuss some irregularities. The FBI hadn't prepared him for this. He sent a quick message through the secure channel and received an immediate response: "Go to the meeting. Act confused if questioned. We have eyes on the building." The executive conference room was on the 20th floor, with floor-to-ceiling windows offering a panoramic view of the city. As Robert stepped inside, he found not only the CEO but also David and 3 other executives he didn't recognize. All wearing expensive suits, all watching him with unreadable expressions. "Mr. Chen," the CEO began, "we've noticed you've been paying particular attention to our international accounts today." Robert's mouth went dry. "Just doing my regular audits, sir." "Really?" David interrupted, sliding a folder across the table. "Because these login records show you accessing files well outside your usual scope." The CEO leaned forward, his expression stern but not unkind. "Robert, we'd like to offer you a promotion. Head of International Accounts. Substantial pay increase, of course. All we need is your discretion." Robert felt the wire under his shirt like it was burning his skin. Were they trying to buy his silence? Or was this a test? Before he could respond, the office lights suddenly went out, plunging the room into the dim light of dusk. "Building-wide power failure," someone announced. "Security protocol dictates immediate evacuation." As they all stood to leave, Robert noticed David pulling out his phone, his face illuminated by the screen's glow. The last thing Robert saw before being ushered out of the room was his supervisor's expression, a mixture of panic and rage. In the chaos of the evacuation, Robert felt a hand grab his arm and pull him into the stairwell. It was Agent Wong, dressed as a maintenance worker. "Things have escalated," he whispered. "We need to move you to a safe house. Now." As they hurried down the stairs, Robert heard shouting above them. The power outage hadn't been an accident, it was the FBI's way of extracting him. But from what? What had he stumbled upon during his day of investigating that had triggered such an urgent response? The answer would prove to be more shocking than anything Robert could have imagined, and the quiet accountant's journey into the heart of a criminal empire was about to take an even darker turn. The safe house turned out to be a modest apartment in a quiet suburb, 30 miles from the city. As Robert sat at a small kitchen table, still in his work clothes, Agent Wong spread out dozens of photographs and documents. The evening light cast long shadows across the evidence of what Robert had unknowingly uncovered during his day at the office. "Those Singapore transactions you found?" Wong began, his voice grave. "They weren't just about money laundering. Each transfer corresponded with a shipment into the port. We've been tracking similar patterns in ports across the country, but could never prove the connection until now." Robert stared at the photos, shipping containers, surveillance shots of men in suits, and satellite images of various ports. "What exactly were they shipping?" "Everything," Wong replied. "Drugs, weapons, forged documents. But that's just the surface. The real operation is human trafficking. They've been using the legitimate business operations of companies like Sterling and Associates to hide their activities. The money you tracked today helped us confirm it." Robert felt sick. All those numbers he'd been processing over the years, how many lives had been hidden in those decimal points? The coffee he'd been drinking threatened to come back up. But why the sudden extraction? Robert asked, trying to steady his voice. "What changed today?" Wong pulled out a laptop and played a security camera feed from the office. It showed David in his office just after Robert had discovered the Singapore transactions. David was on the phone, his face twisted with anger. Though there was no audio, it was clear from his expression that something had gone very wrong. We had his phone tapped, Wong explained. He made a call to someone known only as the accountant, the mastermind behind the entire operation. David said, and I quote, "Chen's looking at the Singapore files. He's definitely working with someone. The previous plan failed. Do we implement Protocol Zero?" Robert's blood ran cold. Protocol Zero? Based on our intelligence, it's their term for eliminating potential threats. The power outage wasn't just to get you out, it was to prevent them from acting. But here's where it gets interesting. Wong pulled out another photo, this one showing the CEO of Sterling and Associates meeting with someone in a parking garage. This was taken 3 hours ago, right after the evacuation. The person meeting with the CEO made Robert's jaw drop. It was Mrs. Lin, his elderly neighbor who had lived next door to him for the past 5 years. In the photo, she didn't look frail or gentle anymore. She stood straight-backed, dressed in an expensive business suit, handing the CEO a thick envelope. "Mrs. Lin is the accountant?" Robert whispered in disbelief. Wong nodded. "She's been hiding in plain sight for years. Using her appearance as a harmless elderly woman to avoid suspicion. She's the one who chose you as the fall guy for the bank robberies. She's been watching you, studying your routines, waiting for the perfect moment to implement their plan." The revelation hit Robert like a physical blow. He thought about all the times Mrs. Lin had brought him homemade dumplings, all the friendly conversations they'd had in the hallway. Had it all been surveillance? Had she been studying him even then? "There's more," Wong continued, pulling out a final document. "The software we gave you today didn't just track transactions, it gave us access to their entire communication network. We found this message sent right after the power outage. The message was brief but chilling: target escaped. Initiate Operation Clean Slate. All assets to be liquidated within 24 hours. They're going to try to erase everything," Wong explained. "All the evidence, all the accounts, all the witnesses. But in their rush to clean up, they'll make mistakes. That's where you come in." Robert looked up sharply. "What do you mean? I thought my part was done." "Far from it. Mrs. Lin chose you because of your skills with numbers, your attention to detail. She was right about one thing: you're the perfect person to unravel their operation. But instead of being their scapegoat, you're going to be their downfall." A laptop was placed in front of Robert, showing a complex network of transactions happening in real time. "They're moving everything right now, trying to hide their assets before we can trace them. But every transaction leaves a trail, and you can follow it better than anyone." Robert watched the numbers flowing across the screen, his mind already starting to see patterns. But a thought nagged at him. "My mother, if Mrs. Lin knows so much about me." "Already taken care of," Wong assured him. "We moved her to a secure location the moment we pulled you out. She thinks she's won an all-expenses-paid spa retreat. She's quite enjoying herself, actually." For the first time since this nightmare began, Robert allowed himself a small smile. Then he turned his attention back to the laptop, his fingers hovering over the keyboard. The numbers were like a language to him, and now he could finally use that knowledge for something that mattered. "We have 24 hours, Wong said, checking his watch. "Can you do it?" Robert was already typing, his eyes focused on the screen. "They thought I was just a boring accountant," he said quietly. "Let's show them how dangerous boring can be." But as Robert began his work, he didn't notice the small red light blinking on his wire, a signal that someone else was listening in. The game wasn't over yet, and the next 24 hours would test everything he thought he knew about himself and the world he lived in. The safe house hummed with activity as midnight approached. Robert had been working non-stop for 6 hours, his fingers flying across the keyboard as he tracked the elaborate web of financial transactions. Empty coffee cups littered the table around him, while FBI analysts bustled about, following up on each lead he uncovered. Look at this, Robert said, pointing to his screen. They're not just moving money, they're creating a digital smokescreen. For every real transaction, there are 5 fake ones. It's like watching a shell game, but with billions of dollars. Agent Wong leaned over his shoulder, studying the complex flow of numbers. Can you cut through it? I already am. Robert's voice held a confidence that surprised even him. See these patterns? They're using the same fractional cent trick, but backwards. The real transactions are hiding behind. He stopped suddenly, his face going pale. What is it? Wong asked, noticing the change in his expression. These accounts, some of them belong to people I know. My dental hygienist, my barber, the owner of the coffee shop I go to every morning. Robert's voice trembled. They've been building this network around me for years. Everyone in my daily life was carefully chosen and placed, Wong finished grimly. They created an entire artificial community to monitor you. The question is, why go to such elaborate lengths? What made you so important to them? Before Robert could respond, one of the FBI analysts burst into the room. Sir, we've got movement at Chen's apartment building. Mrs. Lin was seen entering his unit 10 minutes ago. Wong immediately sprang into action, barking orders into his radio. But Robert barely heard him. His attention was fixed on a new pattern emerging in the data, something that didn't fit with everything else he'd seen. These transactions, he muttered, more to himself than anyone else. They're not just moving money out, they're also moving something in. Something big. He pulled up more records, his mind racing. 5 years ago, when Mrs. Lin had first moved in next door, Sterling and Associates had handled a massive merger with a Chinese technology firm. Robert had worked on the preliminary audits, but had been mysteriously reassigned halfway through the project. Agent Wong, he called out, his voice urgent. I need everything you have on that merger from 5 years ago. The one with Beijing Digital Solutions. Wong made a quick phone call, and within minutes, another agent arrived with a thick file. Robert spread the documents across the table, his eyes darting between the papers and his screen. It's not about me, he said finally, looking up at Wong. It never was. I was just in the way because I almost found it by accident 5 years ago. They've been using Sterling and Associates to develop something they're calling Project Mirror. He turned his laptop around, showing a complex diagram he'd assembled from the financial data. Every transaction, every shell company, every fake account, they all lead back to this. They weren't just laundering money or trafficking goods. They were building a backdoor into the global financial system itself. Wong's face hardened as he studied the diagram. A backdoor? For what purpose? Think about it, Robert explained, his accountant's mind putting the pieces together. With this kind of access, they could manipulate any financial transaction, anywhere in the world. They could crash economies, fund terrorist operations, or steal billions without leaving a trace. And the best part? It would all look like normal banking activity. Suddenly, the lights in the safe house flickered. The laptop screen went black, then displayed a message that made everyone in the room freeze. Welcome back, Robert. Shall we talk? The message was followed by a phone number. Robert's phone, which had been sitting silent on the table, began to ring. The caller ID showed a familiar name, Mom. Wong immediately began tracing the call, but Robert held up his hand. They want to talk to me. After all this time watching me, studying me, they want to make me an offer. It's too dangerous, Wong protested, but Robert was already reaching for the phone. You said it yourself, I'm the perfect person to unravel their operation. Maybe that works both ways. Maybe they need me to make it work. He answered the call, putting it on speaker. Hello, Mrs. Lin. Ah, Robert, the familiar voice replied, but now it held none of the warmth he remembered. "I always said you were too smart for your own good. But perhaps you're finally smart enough to understand what we're offering." Through the speaker, they could hear the gentle clinking of teacups, the same sound he'd heard hundreds of times through his apartment walls. "You have 1 hour to meet me at our usual place. Come alone, and I'll show you what 5 years of watching you has been leading to. Refuse, and, well, let's just say your mother's spa retreat might become permanent." The line went dead. Robert and Wong looked at each other, both knowing this changed everything. The next hour would determine not just Robert's fate, but potentially the stability of the entire global financial system. "I have to go," Robert said quietly, standing up. "But not for the reason they think." He turned back to his laptop, fingers flying across the keyboard one last time. "While we've been talking, I've been buried in their network, mapping every connection, every backup server, every escape route. If I can get close enough to Mrs. Lin's main system." Wong caught on immediately. "You could shut down Project Mirror from the inside." "Exactly. But for that, I need to walk straight into their trap." Robert straightened his tie, a gesture that felt strangely familiar in this unfamiliar situation. "It's time to show them what happens when you push around a boring accountant." But as Robert prepared to face Mrs. Lin, no one in the room noticed that the blinking red light on his wire had stopped blinking entirely. Someone else was making moves in this high-stakes game, and the next hour would reveal just how deep the conspiracy really went. The small tea shop where Robert had spent countless Sunday afternoons with Mrs. Lin looked different in the midnight hour. Through the darkened windows, he could see a single light illuminating a corner table where his elderly neighbor sat, calmly pouring tea from an ornate pot he recognized from their many previous meetings. Before entering, Robert touched the small USB drive hidden in his sleeve, his insurance policy that Wong had given him. The FBI teams were positioned around the block, waiting for his signal. But something told him this conversation wasn't going to go as anyone expected. The bell above the door chimed softly as he entered. Mrs. Lin looked up, smiling that familiar gentle smile that had fooled him for 5 years. "Ah, Robert. Right on time, as always. Please, sit. I've made your favorite, Iron Goddess Oolong." Robert sat down, noting how the tea shop's security cameras had all been turned to face their table. "You went to a lot of trouble to arrange this meeting." "Oh, I've gone to a lot of trouble for many things concerning you, Robert." She poured him a cup of tea with the same graceful movement he'd watched hundreds of times before. "Did you know that when we chose this location for your apartment, we considered 43 different buildings? The sight lines had to be perfect. The community had to be just right. Everything had to be precise. Like the decimal points in those transactions?" Robert asked, not touching his tea. Mrs. Lin's smile widened. "Exactly. Precision is everything in our work. Just as it is in yours. That's why we chose you, you know. Not just because you were good with numbers, but because you understand the beauty of precision." She reached into her bag and pulled out a tablet, sliding it across the table. On the screen, Robert saw something that made his heart skip, a complete replica of the global banking system, but with subtle differences. Hidden pathways, secret connections, all woven so delicately into the existing infrastructure that they were almost invisible. "Project Mirror," Robert breathed. "Beautiful, isn't it?" Mrs. Lin's eyes gleamed. 5 years of work, building a shadow network within the legitimate one. Every transaction in the world will flow through our system, and no one will ever know. Unless, of course, they have your particular talent for noticing details. "Why show me this?" Robert asked, though he already suspected the answer. "Because you've already seen too much to be eliminated," she replied matter-of-factly. "And more importantly, because we need you. Those patterns you spotted in the Singapore transactions? No one else has ever noticed them. Not the FBI, not our own auditors. You have a gift, Robert. She leaned forward, her voice dropping to a whisper. Join us. Help us perfect Project Mirror. We'll pay you more money than you could spend in 10 lifetimes. Your mother will want for nothing. You'll be part of something that will reshape the global economy. Robert's fingers touched the USB drive in his sleeve again. One quick move and he could upload the virus that would destroy their entire network. But something wasn't adding up. If I'm so valuable, why try to frame me for bank robbery? Why not just approach me directly? Mrs. Lin's smile faded slightly. We needed to test you. To see how you would react under pressure. And you performed, unexpectedly well. Even the FBI's intervention was anticipated. Well, mostly anticipated. She glanced at his chest, where the wire had been hidden. Your transmitter stopped working the moment you entered this building, by the way. We're quite alone. Robert felt a chill run down his spine. And if I refuse your offer? Oh, Robert. Mrs. Lin shook her head sadly. You've misunderstood. This isn't an offer. This is an explanation. You're already part of Project Mirror. You have been for 5 years. She turned the tablet around, showing him something that made his blood run cold. Every transaction he'd ever processed at Sterling and Associates, every audit he'd completed, had been quietly feeding data into their shadow network. His work had helped build the very system he was trying to destroy. Your attention to detail, your insistence on precision, you've been helping us refine our algorithms for years. Those patterns you noticed? They were intentionally placed there, gradually training you to see exactly what we needed you to see. Robert's mind raced. If what she was saying was true, then the FBI's plan to destroy the network wouldn't work. He had helped build its defenses, unknowingly creating safeguards against exactly the kind of attack they were planning. And now, Mrs. Lin continued, we're ready for the final phase. Tonight, at exactly 3 a.m., Project Mirror goes live. Every bank, every financial institution, every digital transaction on Earth will pass through our network. And you, Robert, will help us ensure it works perfectly. She pulled out another device, smaller than the tablet. Your mother says hello, by the way. The spa is lovely this time of year. It would be a shame if anything happened to. The device clattered to the table as Mrs. Lin's eyes suddenly widened. She reached for her throat, gasping. The teacup in front of her, her own cup, had left a slight red stain on her lips. Impossible, she whispered. The tea. Iron Goddess Oolong, Robert said quietly. My favorite, remember? The one you served every Sunday for 5 years. Long enough for me to learn exactly how you prepare it. Long enough to notice that you always drink from the cup with the small chip on the rim. The one I specifically chose tonight. Mrs. Lin's face contorted with a mixture of rage and something that might have been respect. You weren't supposed to be capable of this kind of deception. Our profiles, our data, showed you exactly what I wanted you to see, Robert finished. For 5 years, you watched me. But who was watching you? As Mrs. Lin slumped forward, the door burst open. But it wasn't the FBI team that entered. Instead, a group of men in dark suits walked in, led by a familiar face, Agent Wong. But the badge he now held up wasn't FBI. Interpol, he announced, looking at Robert with newfound respect. Well done, Agent Chen. 5 years of deep cover, and you never broke character. Not once. Robert stood up, straightening his tie. She was right about one thing, he said, looking down at Mrs. Lin's unconscious form. Precision is everything. But as the Interpol team secured the scene, Robert's phone buzzed with a text from an unknown number. Did you really think it would be that easy? Check your mother's location again. The game wasn't over. In fact, it was about to become more dangerous than ever. The Interpol Command Center, hastily set up in a vacant office building, was a hive of activity. Screens displayed maps, surveillance feeds, and cascading lines of financial data. Robert stood in the center of it all, his tie loosened, sleeves rolled up, as he coordinated with teams across 3 continents. "The spa resort where we thought my mother was being held is empty," he reported, his voice tense. "They moved her at least 6 hours ago. And Project Mirror is still counting down to activation." Mrs. Lin was just a piece of the puzzle, not the whole game. Wong, or whatever his real name was, nodded grimly. "Your mother's phone signal is bouncing between towers in 5 different cities. They're using our own surveillance methods against us." Robert turned to the largest screen, where the Project Mirror interface glowed ominously. 2 hours until activation. His 5 years of deep cover work had led to this moment, but something wasn't adding up. "Show me the original Sterling and Associates merger documents again," he demanded. An analyst quickly pulled them up. Robert's eyes scanned the pages, looking for what he knew had to be there. "Wait," he said suddenly. "The signature on page 47, it's different from the others. The pressure points in the handwriting." Wong leaned in. "What do you see? It's not just a signature. It's a code." Robert's fingers flew across the keyboard, entering sequences of numbers. "Look at the stroke patterns. Each variation corresponds to a location. They've been planning this endpoint since the very beginning." The screen flickered, then displayed a new map. A single point pulsed red on the outskirts of the city, an abandoned technology campus that had been shut down years ago. "That's where they're keeping her," Robert said with certainty. "And that's where Project Mirror's primary servers are located." Mrs. Lin's operation was just the public face. "The real control center has been right here all along." Wong began mobilizing teams, but Robert held up his hand. "No. They'll be expecting that. They've been watching us watching them for years. We need to do something they won't expect." He pulled up his own personnel file, not the fake one he'd built for his cover, but his real Interpol record. 5 years ago, before this assignment, I wasn't just an accountant. I was a systems penetration specialist. That's why they chose me for this operation." His fingers danced across the keyboard, pulling up blueprints of the abandoned campus. The building's original security system was never fully deactivated. It's still there, dormant, running on its own isolated power grid. If I can access it. "You want to use their own sanctuary against them," Wong realized. "Exactly. But I'll need to be on site to do it. And..." Robert hesitated. "I'll need you to let me go in alone." Wong's expression darkened. "Absolutely not. Protocol dictates." "Protocol is exactly what they're expecting," Robert interrupted. "They've had 5 years to study how we operate. Every procedure, every fail-safe, they know it all. The only way to beat them is to break our own rules." A tense silence filled the room. Finally, Wong spoke. "You're not suggesting this just to save your mother, are you?" Robert met his gaze steadily. "No. I'm suggesting it because it's the only way to stop Project Mirror. Finding my mother is personal motivation." After a long moment, Wong nodded. "You have 1 hour. After that, we're coming in, whether you've succeeded or not." Robert gathered what he needed: a laptop, some specialized equipment, and his old accountant's ID badge from Sterling and Associates. Sometimes the best way to hide was in plain sight. As he prepared to leave, Wong pulled him aside. "There's something else you should know." When Mrs. Lin was taken into custody, she said something. She said even Lin didn't see it coming. Robert froze. "She used her own name in the third person?" "Exactly. We did some quick checking. The real Mrs. Lin died 6 years ago in Beijing. Whoever we arrested tonight. Was another layer of deception, Robert finished. Which means the person really running this operation is still out there, Wong confirmed. And they know you better than you think. Robert thought about the past 5 years, every conversation, every interaction, every seemingly random encounter. Who had been watching the watchers? The answer hit him like a physical blow. There was only one person who had been there before Mrs. Lin, before Sterling and Associates, before everything. Someone who had helped shape his entire career path. I know who it is, he whispered. And I know why they chose me. He rushed to the door, then paused. If I'm not back in an hour, check the original case file from when I joined Interpol. Look at who recommended me for the deep cover program. As Robert disappeared into the night, Wong turned to the case file. What he found there would change everything they thought they knew about the operation. But Robert was already gone, heading toward a confrontation 5 years in the making. The true architect of Project Mirror was waiting for him, and this time, there would be no more masks, no more deceptions. Just the truth, and a race against time to prevent a global financial catastrophe. The abandoned technology campus loomed against the pre-dawn sky, its dark windows reflecting the first hints of approaching daylight. Robert approached the main entrance, his heart pounding but his hands steady. The security panel still worked, just as he'd predicted, accepting his old Sterling and Associates ID card with a soft beep. Inside, the building hummed with hidden power, definitely not abandoned after all. Emergency lights cast a pale blue glow across dusty floors and empty cubicles. But beneath the facade of abandonment, Robert could hear the distinctive whir of servers running at full capacity. As he navigated the familiar corridors, his mind returned to the moment 10 years ago when he'd first been approached about joining Interpol. It had been right after he'd graduated with his accounting degree, top of his class. His mentor, Professor Helen Zhang, had called him into her office. Robert stopped dead in his tracks. The pieces suddenly clicked into place. I was wondering when you'd figure it out, a voice called from the darkness. A figure stepped into the light, Professor Zhang, the woman who had guided his entire career, looking exactly as she had a decade ago. You, Robert said softly. It was you all along. Before Mrs. Lin, before Sterling and Associates. You created me. Helen smiled, the same encouraging smile that had once helped him through complex financial theories. Created you? No, Robert. I recognized you. Your potential. Your perfect combination of skills, the precision of an accountant, the instincts of an investigator, and most importantly, the ability to see patterns that others miss. She gestured around them. All of this? Project Mirror? It's as much your creation as mine. Every transaction you analyzed, every audit you performed, you were helping me perfect the system. The only question was which side you would choose when the moment came. Where's my mother? Robert demanded. Safe, Helen replied. Unlike our friend Mrs. Lin, or rather, the actress playing her, I don't believe in unnecessary cruelty. Your mother is exactly where we said she was, enjoying her spa retreat. Completely unaware of anything unusual. I would never harm her, Robert. That's not how a teacher treats her star pupil's family. Robert's mind raced. 40 minutes until Project Mirror activated. 30 minutes until Interpol would storm the building. And somewhere in this facility, servers were preparing to hijack the global financial system. Why? He asked, buying time as he carefully positioned himself near a particular junction box. Why create something that could destroy the world's economy? Helen's eyes lit up, the same expression she'd worn when explaining complex financial theories. Destroy it? No, I'm going to save it. The current system is chaotic, inefficient, vulnerable to human greed and error. Project Mirror will bring order. Every transaction monitored, every financial flow optimized, every irregularity instantly detected and corrected. By putting you in control, Robert noted. By putting mathematics in control, she corrected. Pure, perfect mathematical precision. The human element removed from the equation. Isn't that what you've always loved about accounting, Robert? The beautiful clarity of numbers? She moved to a nearby terminal, typing rapidly. Look at this. 5 years of your work, combined with my algorithms. Together, we've created something revolutionary. Robert approached the terminal, appearing to study the screen. But his hand slipped into his pocket, fingers closing around a small device. You taught me well, he said. Maybe too well. Because you're right, I do see patterns. Like the pattern of how you manipulated my entire life to bring me to this moment. And another pattern, hidden in your perfect system. Helen's expression shifted slightly. Oh. Project Mirror isn't about removing the human element from finance. It's about controlling it. Every transaction tracked, every purchase monitored, every financial decision subject to your approval. It's not order, it's surveillance. And control. Sometimes, Helen said softly, students exceed their teachers' expectations. She pulled out a gun, pointing it steadily at Robert. I had hoped you would understand. That you would see the beauty of what we've created. I do see it, Robert replied. And that's why I have to stop it. In one fluid motion, he dropped and rolled, throwing the small device from his pocket. Helen fired, but the bullet hit only air. The device hit the junction box and exploded in a shower of sparks. Emergency lights flared as the building's original security system surged to life, responding to the electrical surge. Fire doors slammed shut, containment protocols activating. In the server room below, automated fire suppression systems engaged, flooding the delicate equipment with foam. No! Helen screamed, running to the terminal. The servers are being destroyed as we speak, Robert finished, standing up. Along with all your backup data. Did you really think I spent 5 years here without learning every detail of the building's original systems? Some students do exceed their teachers' expectations. Helen turned, raising the gun again, but froze at the sound of multiple footsteps approaching. Right on time, Robert said as Wong and the Interpol team burst in. I figured out why you chose this building. Its original security systems were designed by the same company that designed Interpol's protocols. You studied our playbook because you helped write it. So I decided to write a new one. As Helen was taken into custody, Wong approached Robert. Your mother's been found. She's safe, exactly where they said she was. Completely unaware anything was wrong. Robert nodded, relief washing over him. And Project Mirror? The servers are destroyed. The algorithm is gone. The global financial system remains. Wong smiled slightly, boring and inefficient as ever. Later, as the sun rose over the city, Robert stood outside the building watching the Interpol teams wrap up their operation. His phone buzzed, a text from his mother, having a wonderful time at the spa. Though the accounting department at work keeps calling. Something about you missing meetings? Robert smiled, typing back, just some boring accounting stuff, Mom. Nothing exciting ever happens in my line of work. He looked up at the building one last time. 5 years of deep cover, playing the role of an ordinary accountant. And in the end, it wasn't his training as an Interpol agent that had saved the day, it was his actual skills as an accountant. The ability to see patterns, to understand systems, to know that sometimes the most important details are hidden in the smallest numbers. As he walked away, his Sterling and Associates ID card fell from his pocket, cracking on the pavement. Another piece of his cover identity, breaking apart. But that was okay. He had a feeling his next assignment would require a whole new set of identities. After all, there were always more patterns to uncover, more numbers to analyze, more mysteries hidden in plain sight. And somewhere out there, another Professor Zhang was probably already planning their next move. But that was a problem for another day. Right now, he had a spa retreat to visit, and a mother who would never know how close she'd come to being caught in the crossfire of a global financial conspiracy. As Robert Chen, accountant, agent, and now hero, drove away from the scene, he couldn't help but smile at the thought that crossed his mind: sometimes the most dangerous weapons aren't guns or bombs, but spreadsheets and decimal points. And sometimes the most important victories are the ones that history will never know about, the disasters prevented by people willing to look closely at the numbers, and brave enough to act on what they find.